Okay, anyway, should we kick off? So welcome everyone to the Digital Landscape Review Show and Tell, nearly at the end of March, but lots to talk about today. So we're going to move on to this slide. Here's a little bit about what we're going to go through. We're going to talk a little bit about us and what we're doing, as we always do. Then we have a lot to talk about in terms of the main landscape review, talking about what we've been doing since the last time we spoke a couple of weeks ago and kind of things we're starting to understand. Also covering the work we're doing on digital inclusion. We'll have an update from Aoife on that. Our survey is now closed, and so a little bit of looking at what we've been hearing from around Wales. We had some really good responses there, and then some space for questions at the end. So probably a couple of notes on how we're set up here. As always, we have Nerys, who is on the Welsh to English channel and is available. If anyone has any questions in Welsh, we're very happy to take those. And as we said earlier, we are recording this session. They do find their way onto the CDPS YouTube channel, and obviously along with all our previous show and tells, if you want to go back and have a look at the kind of things we've done to date. Any questions as you go along, feel free to add those in the chat. We'll try and pick them up as we go along, but there is space at the end as well. So a little bit about who we are. We are CDPS, Centre for Digital Public Services in Wales. We're here to support Wales deliver better digital public services sustainably. We move on to the next slide. This is the team. You'll be hearing from myself, Henry, and Aoife today, but that's the wider team who are helping to support delivery of the landscape review. At that point, I think this is the point where I hand over to Henry to tell us about what we've done in the last period. Over to you, Henry.
Thank you, Rick. So yeah, we're going to start by talking about the main landscape review, which, if this is your first show and tell you're joining, this is a project where we're trying to uncover and evidence the most significant challenges currently present in digital services so that we can work together to solve them. This is a slightly different framing maybe of the work that we've done previously, where we've talked more about kind of understanding how digital services are currently delivered, and probably reflects the shift at this point in the project where we're starting to think about what we do with the data that we gathered and what actually CDPS and our partners should do as a result. I'll talk about that more in a moment. This is just an overview of who we've spoken to. So we identified 30 organisations that we were keen to speak to in this beta phase, which we started in January. That was particularly focusing on local authorities and health and care, as that's kind of the sectors of public services within Wales where we had less coverage previously. So we're really keen to get a broader view of how digital is delivered in those areas. We're then keen to speak to some of the sponsored bodies that we've not spoken to yet in order to get that full view of the range of services delivered in Wales. And there's a few Welsh Government teams with specific remits that we're keen to speak to as they relate to areas that we're interested in. We have spoken to 10 so far, with another 4 that we have booked in, but we're keen to keep meeting with more people and understanding how they deliver digital as we go. If I go on then, so I mentioned that we have been thinking about the data that we gather and what we do about it slightly differently. The team has shifted to thinking about investment cases for digital transformation. So we're trying to identify both the significant challenges that span across organizations and across services, where we think CDPS, CDOs and other digital leaders have a place to help tackle these challenges. We're then thinking about the landscape review as making the case for investing in these areas, bringing together the evidence that we have gathered from speaking to so many people, and then assessing actually how these measure up against each other. We found it helpful to think about 4 different types of challenges. So in some cases where we're speaking to organizations, we hear about specific services where they think that actually they could deliver that service in a slightly different way that might work better both for them and for the people who are using that service. And there's some examples there on the left that we've heard about from people we've spoken to. There's then some shared challenges, which is more about kind of underpinning parts of services or ways of working for how we deliver digital. So the example there, services having manual approaches to case management, where maybe both the users don't have such a joined up experience of using a service, they're contacting different teams, and maybe internally organizations haven't fully joined up that one service so that their staff have a single view of where someone's got to. We're then also thinking about broad platforms or components of services. So that's where it might be possible to build something that other services use really effectively. And then finally, this fourth category is a little bit different. This is a bit more forward-looking, where we've looked at which policies or services might be coming up that actually might need support in terms of digital. We've particularly looked at the programme for governance, and maybe there's an example there of piloting an approach to basic income, which is something the Welsh Government has talked about doing, and we're keen just to understand if there is an element of digital needed within that, and maybe what we could do to support that. At the moment, we're quite actively thinking about 12 investment cases, but there are a number of others that we've heard about that we are kind of considering and that might get pulled into the review at a later point. But at the moment, these are the 12 that we've mapped on this matrix that we're most actively thinking about. We're keen to identify which of these are the most impactful or which would be most worth us and our partners working on. And there are a number of different criteria that would lead us to choosing one. We've mapped just two here just to kind of show how they vary. So this thinks both about kind of strategic alignment to CDPS's goals, and the things that we're particularly really thinking about within that is whether these opportunities would help us build support for the digital strategy for Wales, particularly mission 1 around building great digital services. And then on that x-axis, we're thinking about whether these opportunities would have a really visible benefit to citizens. So we're thinking that where possible, we're keen to work on things that end users, where end users will actually see a difference to the services that they use. There are, of course, a number of other criteria that are really important. You know, we of course want to assess the scale of benefits from working on a particular opportunity, and we want to think about the feasibility of a particular opportunity. But this is just a couple of those important criteria in choosing what we work on. I would also say that where these opportunities are currently placed is based on what we know at the moment, but every week we are speaking to new services, new organizations, and this is a constantly evolving picture as we get to the end of this phase and we see which of these we want to put forward. I'll then just talk about 2 of these investment cases in particular today, just to give a sense of how we're thinking about them. The first of them is thinking about online forms. So online forms is where we want to collect data from a service user, and we want to do that in as efficient and an easy way as possible. We've seen this really repeatedly be a really big priority for service owners and for service users. So this is so that the current state might be either downloadable PDFs or downloadable Word documents that someone might fill in, or it could even be printing off and filling in paper forms in some cases. We think that e-forms are easier to use, they're more accessible, that it's easier to collect and reuse data when you've collected it in that way, and it's easier to integrate that data collection in with other technology systems. What this slide shows is just the scale of this as a challenge. So about a third of, or more than a third of organizations have raised this as a specific focus of theirs within their digital strategy, which is relatively high relative to other opportunities that we've looked at. From analysing about 400 services to look at kind of what different components were needed, we found that about 80% of services need to input and store data directly from users in some way. So this is quite a key point of service design for many different services. Is someone asking a question? No. And then finally, that's just very practically of the organizations that we've spoken to in beta. So of the 10 that we've spoken to, 9 are still using PDFs or paper forms in some form. So it is still very much a current problem. In terms of how this affects users then, there's a few key benefits here. I thought I'd think about an example that we heard about quite recently. So we heard about a local authority housing service that's actually still sending out individual forms to be printed. So the housing team is sending forms to the central printing team. That's then being posted to users. The users are filling out that paper form and returning it in the post, and that's then being rescanned to enter into the organization's CRM. And this is quite a good example of some of these benefits that are up on the page. So it's clearly taking those users an awful lot longer to provide that information than if they could just go straight to an online form. It's also spending a lot of internal staff time on printing and scanning, and those kind of manual processes are much more likely to introduce errors into the data. So quite a practical example there of where shifting to online forms could bring real benefit to the service and their users. Finally, we are through this project also looking to other areas, so to England in this case, but also to other countries to see where there have been successes with some of these challenges. Here is a case study from Waverley Borough Council, which undertook a project in 2017 to upgrade all their existing online forms. Through doing that, they were able to reduce the number of phone calls that they're receiving by more than 10%. They were able to increase their online transactions by almost 20%, and they saved almost £100,000, which seems like a really great initiative. We have spoken to councils in Wales who have undertaken similar projects over the last year of getting rid of all of their PDFs through a total transformation of their website. But many organisations still have some way to go in this, and that's what we're keen to look into. The second case then I'll talk about is buying. So thinking about how organisations choose what to buy and then how they practically procure digital services and tools. So here again, this is, I think, actually the most commonly raised challenge of all that we asked about through the landscape review. So 2/3 of organisations proactively raise procurement as one of their key challenges. More recently then, of the local authorities we've spoken to, we have seen a particular trend in issues around cloud licensing. So procuring of kind of SaaS products and other similar things. Here are a couple of things on the page about how organisations are experiencing challenges with buying, but I thought I'd add to that a bit with kind of some of the things that we've heard. So we have heard repeatedly kind of challenges with knowing what to buy and assessing the most suitable products, and I think organisations don't necessarily have the clearest guidance at the moment on how to go about that process of choosing the right things. An area within that we've also heard about is how current procurement processes make it quite difficult for organisations to understand the art of the possible, and they sometimes feel quite constrained by choosing the kind of standard solution that they can see their peers are using at the moment. That's where we might think about steps like running discoveries and then going into alpha as a way to understand that art of the possible a bit better. We've also heard challenges with kind of internal processes for procurement, where, for example, we've seen in some organisations IT teams being frustrated where service teams are leading on procurement and they're not able to input on security and integration. We've seen in other organisations where the IT teams are leading on procurement and service teams feel left out and not able to contribute on the kind of user experience that they're seeing and the operations of their service. So some challenges around kind of the internal processes for procurement. And then finally, we've seen relatively little evidence of joint procurement, but there are some really good examples. So looking at the SRS partnership, the local government or NHS shared services, where many organisations have come together to procure things together. So there are definitely some good examples there. We've done a little bit of analysis just into the digital marketplace, which is a platform provided by the UK government Crown Commercial Services. This is a platform that supports public sector organisations to procure digital and cloud services and tries to make that as straightforward as possible. It has 3 frameworks within it, so looking at procuring cloud, digital specialists and data centres. We've had a look at this data just to see how Welsh organisations' uptake of that platform compares to the rest of the UK. what we found is that actually most organisations in Wales have used the digital marketplace in recent years. So about 80% of the 100 Welsh public organisations that we are aware of. But then if we look at that usage relative to the volume on the platform, we see much lower take-up. So of total expenditure, of total public services expenditure, we estimate that Wales spends about 5% of the total public service expenditure in the UK. But then if we look at the value of contracts on the digital marketplace, Wales has only about 0.5% of the spend on the platform. So about an order of magnitude difference in how much is being spent on the platform by Welsh organisations. If we then look at which organisations are using it more so, this is probably quite a predictable picture, but it's mostly within local government and NHS that the expenditure there lies. So I think if we were to look into this in more detail, it's those areas that we would want to focus on first. Just some analysis then of the potential benefits of looking into this area. We've done some background research of what we think the savings could be from investing in commodity buying, and we think that there could be up to an 8 million saving in the organisations that we've looked at, and potentially almost £1 million saving in redeploying staff to higher value activities. There are some really good case studies of this kind of initiative elsewhere. So for example, looking at the NHS London Procurement Partnership, which estimates that they're saving their members, which is roughly NHS London, but with some other organisations around the fringes of London that have joined in, they're saving their organisations about £3 million per week, which is really impressive. That is the end of the main landscape review section. I think we'll probably go through the digital inclusion first, and then we'll come back to questions at the end.
Great, thank you, Henry. So just to recap on our project goal, so if we go on to the next slide. So for those of you who have been here before, or for those of you who don't know, we're working with the Welsh Government Office of the Chief Digital Officer to create a single directory which looks at what people are doing to support individuals to get online in Wales. So this will be a single overview and aims to capture a wide range of organisations. So we've mostly done the data collection for that directory now, and we're going to start a bit of analysis. So on our survey, this was sent out through 3 different networks. We've received a total of 48 responses. So that was through people either filling out the form directly or us sending them a spreadsheet to fill out. And that gave a total of 154 different activities. That's in addition to the activities that we already collected from Digital Communities Wales, and the other ones that we had through desk research or organisations pointing us through other forms that they'd already filled out. So on that, if you haven't been able to respond yet, and we still really love to hear what you're doing and really keen to capture more organisations in our directory, and we've had a few trickling in today as well. Unfortunately, this might not be included in our analysis for Easter, but we definitely still want that in the directory so people know what you're doing. In terms of what else we've done since last time, so last time I mentioned we'd spoken to Northern Ireland and Scotland on their digital inclusion policies, and we also spoke to the Department of Culture, Media and Sport about digital inclusion in England. And then we've been doing a detailed analysis on sort of the different approaches that the UK nations have taken on digital inclusion. And Henry's just going to run us through a bit of our findings so far.
Thank you, Aoife. Yeah, so over the last couple of weeks, we have focused on that question of how do the 4 UK nations compare in their approach to digital inclusion while we're getting in all of that more detailed data from Welsh organisations. I think that there's some really interesting findings when we look at how the 4 nations have approached this problem. So we've spoken to people working in each of the 4 administrations, and I think each very much see digital inclusion as a challenge, and they are committed to solving it. But we've seen quite a variation in how they've actually gone about doing that. So Wales, Northern Ireland, Scotland have all got core centralised programmes for delivering digital inclusion. particularly the delivery aspect of that, so giving out devices and training people with core digital skills. And of course, in Wales, we have Digital Communities Wales as that centralised programme here. If we then look at the funding across those different, sorry, I should say that England doesn't have a core centralised programme. They do have a policy team based in DCMS, and that aims to coordinate activities across the other government departments. But it is more the case that, for example, DFE would have a project giving out devices to school children, and that would be separate from a different programme delivered by DWP. And there is no kind of centralised budget for digital inclusion as we have in Wales. If we look at funding, there's quite a significant difference in annual funding for those core programmes, with Scotland committing £48 million over 2 years to their Connecting Scotland programme, which is significantly higher than the other nations, with Wales then again quite a bit higher than England and Northern Ireland in this space. It's interesting then to compare, well, this is an example of one of the activities that we've been asking about. So this is practically giving out devices to people. Again, it's interesting to compare the 4 nations approach there. So Wales, England and Northern Ireland have very much focused on giving devices to school pupils. The vast majority of, so this is, for example, laptops and tablets and maybe mobile phones to allow people to access the internet. And in Wales, England and Northern Ireland, the focus has very much been on school children, whereas Scotland has focused more resources on other groups, particularly those from low income backgrounds. If we look at then the number of devices that have been given out, that have been purchased, and that is a key difference as well. So in terms of the number of devices purchased, England has purchased the most number of devices, but actually on a per capita basis, Wales has delivered more than 3 times as many as England as the next highest per capita. But something that we should call out on these devices is that there's quite different approaches between some of the nations on how they give them out. So in Scotland, a large portion of that of their expenditure on digital inclusion is that they give out an individual device to every person who receives support from the Connecting Scotland programme. Meanwhile, the approach with Digital Communities Wales has been to purchase devices that they hold centrally and then loan out to organisations to use to support people either through training or so that they can access services. So quite a different approach there on how the devices are used. If we then look more at internet infrastructure, this is another key area that the governments are thinking about in terms of digital inclusion. All nations are part of Project Gigabit, which is a £5 billion broadband infrastructure project. It is interesting to see how organisations compare at the moment on their level of gigabit capable broadband. Northern Ireland is significantly further ahead, with more than 3/4 of Northern Ireland able to access gigabit broadband, whereas with Wales, it's around about a little bit more than 1/3 of people who are able to access this. We should say that gigabit is seen, which is really very fast internet access, is seen as kind of the future-proofing infrastructure. So it's not necessarily needed for typical uses of the internet at the moment, but it is expected that over time, these kind of speeds will become more necessary to engage in technologies. So this is more of a forward-looking view. If we then look at mobile internet, it's helpful to think about not spots, which is areas that I'm sure people have experienced in the countryside where there is particularly poor mobile internet. If we see there, again, there's quite a variation between the nations, with England having much lower proportions of not spots. Only 2% of their landmass has that lower access, while in Scotland it's up to 18%. So quite a big variation there also. That is just a brief overview of some of the things that we are finding when we look at the 4 nations. If I just finish then with what we're planning to do over the next couple of weeks. So we are working with Data Map Wales, as we're keen that some of the data that we brought in via our survey can be mapped and shared publicly through that platform. We are particularly focusing on analysing the data on those 150 activities that we've got and combining that with this wider research we've done into how Wales compares to other nations on delivering digital inclusion. And we are planning to produce a draft report to share with both CDPS and Welsh Government initially by the 8th of April, and then hopefully publishing not long after that. And that's what we're planning to work on. That then takes me to the second question slide, and potentially we can open up to questions on either side. Could I ask someone else in the team who's been looking at the questions if there's any in the chat that we should answer?
Sure. So we haven't actually got anything in the chat bar in terms of questions. So probably we just pause there. If there's any, I know we've covered a lot today on both the main landscape review and on the digital inclusion side. If there's any questions that you're burning to have answered, we are here to answer those. I think, oh, Janine, thank you. Janine has a hand up. Over to you, Janine.
Sorry, I was struggling to find the hand button. I was finding all sorts of other buttons. Which should do funny things. Just a quick question from me, and you might have just answered it in the closing remarks of the presentation. So you talked about emerging opportunities around online forms and procurement. Is it the intention that those emerging opportunities form part of the report that you were talking about by the 8th of April, or are you expecting to have further conversations or discussions with people? I'm particularly interested in the procurement one, because I just wondered if you needed any facilitated introduction to our procurement colleagues here. That was part of the reason for the question.
Thanks, Janine. So the two kind of halves of the landscape review that we've talked about today are relatively separate in terms of their outputs. So of course, they do inform each other. Digital inclusion is very relevant to many of those opportunities that we talked about. That 8th deadline is specifically for the digital inclusion review. So looking at... Oh,
sorry.
No worries. In terms of timelines then for the main landscape review, so we are sharing with our board in mid-April, and we're planning to discuss those, I guess, internally as an organisation. And then I think we would be keen to discuss those with CDOs elsewhere, with your office and other digital leaders. I think it's still slightly in discussion exactly what the process will be for taking those forward. So we can't speak about it more than that now. I think with the procurement case, we had planned to reach out to the procurement team. I think we've messaged Will in your team about, sorry, Will might be here today, but I can't see the people who are here, about reaching out to the procurement team. And I think we're really keen to do that before we take any of these kind of further than that. So potentially we could follow up with that later, but yeah, we would definitely like to speak to that team about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Will's entirely tied up on Ukraine work at the moment, so he might not be here. Dave Nicholson would be your person, so if you want me to make an introduction, Henry, then I'm very happy to do so.
Perfect.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Any more questions from anyone else on the call? Okay. I'm not seeing anything coming up at the moment, Henry. Should we move on?
Yeah.
So it's like, I guess probably the usual end slide that we always show. If you want to get in touch for any of the work that we're doing, there is the email address on the screen. That's our joint team mailbox, so we monitor that for anything coming in. We can also, as we said earlier, if you want to view any of the previous show and tells, that's on the CDPS YouTube channel. And our next show and tell, we've missed a slide here. It's not on the 1st of March. There is one more in 2 weeks' time, which I'm sure someone of the team can tell me. I believe it's the 14th of April, maybe.
The 12th of April.
Excellent. Thank you, Roshan, for saving my calendar embarrassment there. Okay, and at that point, I think we can bring things to a close. Many thanks all for attending, and look forward to talking to you again next time.
Thanks all.